Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. We're all here today to announce a lawsuit against the Trump administration to block new rules that came out last week that remove significant court order protections against the mistreatment of immigrant children. These new rules allow for indefinite detention of children and families in facilities without adequate standards of care or, importantly, state oversight. I'm going to introduce a number of the folks who are here today and who have just been real partners in the work we're doing in a variety of areas, and particularly on issues related to these children and families at the border. So we are joined by a number of state legislators, including Senator Joe Wynn, Senator Lisa Wellman, Representative Nicole Macri, Representative Tina Orwell, and Representative Lillian Ortiz-Self. We so appreciate all of them on short notice coming on down here and just indicating their strong support for the work that we're doing, and they've been true partners on issues here at the state and national level on these issues. We're also joined by two key members of Governor Jay Inslee's team. Catherine Leathers and Alejandro Sanchez are both here today as well. And I think it goes without saying, Governor Inslee has obviously been a key partner on all of our litigation. We've now filed nearly 50 lawsuits against the administration, and I'm fortunate indeed to have a governor who supports that work, makes state agencies available to us and their expertise in the cases that we bring. Also, we're joined by Julie Bildhauer from Kids in Need of Defense. You'll hear us referring to that organization as KIND, Kids in Need of Defense, KIND. KIND is a non-profit law firm dedicated to protecting the rights of immigrant youth, another key partner for us in the work that we do, and we so appreciate her being here. Their firm is representing unaccompanied immigrant children, including many affected by the Trump administration's immigration policies. I'm also joined, of course, by a number of folks from my legal team here in the AG's office, including the Division Chief for the Wing Luke Civil Rights Division, Colleen Melody, Assistant Attorney General Laura Clinton, who will be helping answer questions that you may have about the case itself, our investigator Alma Paletti, legal assistant Vanessa Salinas, and paralegal Jenna Williams. There's a lot of folks who work extremely hard in my office on these cases, as you know. They put in very long hours to make these cases happen, and I deeply appreciate their work. And you'll hear in a declaration that we'll be filing with this case some of the results of their work with our state partners on telling the stories of these children who are now here in Washington State and have suffered significant trauma as a result of their experience at the border due to the actions of the Trump administration. So what we're going to do is give you an overview of the litigation, which we'll be filing today in the Central District of California. And then, of course, we'll take your questions. Sadly, this subject is nothing new to my legal team. They've also worked on our case challenging the Trump administration's family separation policy. This case is just the next sad chapter in the history of the Trump administration's legacy of cruelty to immigrants. The current policies of this administration have already devastated young lives, and you're going to hear, as I said before, about some of those experiences in a declaration that we'll be filing shortly. Our goal, of course, is to put a stop to these changes that the Trump administration is proposing. So today's lawsuit challenges new rules published Friday by the Trump administration that override a long-standing court-approved settlement agreement known as the Flores Agreement. So you hear about this Flores case, the Flores Agreement. As you know, that's what's at issue here. As you know, the government has been unwilling to meet those standards set forth in that Flores Agreement with disastrous consequences. Now, rather than meeting their legal and moral obligation under the Flores Agreement, the Trump administration proposed on Friday to let themselves out of that agreement. So just to be clear, they have obligations under that agreement to provide for adequate treatment of immigrant families and children, right? Number two, the Trump administration has been unwilling to meet those obligations, as has been well reported and documented. Number three, why we're here today is because now the Trump administration seeks to not have to follow those rules at all. Rather than meet them, let's just be done with them. The administration's new rules will allow prolonged, even indefinite detention of immigrant children and families, detaining immigrant children in unlicensed facilities. They also set inadequate standards of care that the federal government can suspend anytime it deems there is a, quote, influx of immigration. They also remove the state's ability to regulate facilities that house these kids inside our state borders, and you'll hear about that from me shortly. The Flores Agreement is rooted in a court case originally filed in the mid-1980s, and that governed, up till now, as I said, the humane treatment of immigrant children. It set limits on the length of detention. It set standards of treatment. It set guidelines for their release to adult relatives or state licensed programs. This case, as I mentioned before, is being filed in the Central District of California before the same court that has been overseeing the Flores case. That court is very familiar with these issues, and that is why we're filing this case in California. I'm often asked why you file a case in Washington versus some other state. That's the reason we're going to California and joining with a large group of states and other AGs. You've probably read, for example, about litigation around whether kids can have access to toothbrushes, for example. That's the Flores case, and that's why we're going there. So again, rather than trying to meet these standards, doing their duty under the law, including, I would argue, a moral requirement, the Trump administration is trying to rewrite those rules under the Flores Agreement. States have a well-established role in licensing and regulating facilities and foster families that house immigrant children for the federal government. The administration's new rules cut the states out of the process entirely, allowing this administration to avoid state oversight. That's the same administration who earlier this year argued in front of a panel of federal judges that soap, toothbrushes, and a decent place to sleep were not necessarily required elements of a, quote, safe and sanitary detention environment. The impacts of this administration's scorched earth immigration policies are devastating and long-lasting to these kids. In July, inspectors from the Washington Department of Children, Youth, and Families, along with staff from my office, interviewed more than 20 immigrant children who were transferred over the past year by federal officials to state licensed facilities here in Washington state. During this particular 3 days in July, and this is the substance of the declaration that you'll be getting copies of, during this particular 3 days in July, there were 28 immigrant kids in Washington state facilities. These are kids who either have no sponsor or the federal government refuses to release them to a sponsor. Therefore, they end up in a state licensed facility. The number of these children in Washington facilities fluctuates depending upon the numbers of new placement and releases. So again, just to be clear, the 28 children that we'll be talking a bit about here today, many of whom make up the declaration that you see. That was a 3-day period, a moment in time, in which we had 28 children here in Washington state. I'll let you read the declaration for yourself, but I think it's fair to say that the stories that are told by those children in that declaration are heart-wrenching in the extreme. In detention, almost all reported lights being kept on 24 hours a day and freezing temperatures. Others reported being woken up 2, 3, or 4 times in the middle of the night for roll call, then having their blankets taken away for the day at 4 a.m. In one facility, a girl described how guards would throw food on the grounds of the cell and fights would break out over the food because there was not enough food to go around. Girls on their periods reported not being offered showers or a change of clothes when appropriate and were only given 1 sanitary pad per day. Some of the kids reported being housed in cells with children as young as 4 or 5 years old without their parents. Other children were told to take care of the younger kids and were threatened with punishment if they were unable to keep the younger kids from crying. Others reported that younger kids were sometimes put in small metal cages on their own if they misbehaved, or locked alone in dark rooms if they asked too many questions or if they cried too much. We expect to file more details about the experience of these children with the court at a later date. The Trump administration's new rules will also strip our state's ability to hold facilities accountable to the standards dictated by our own state's child welfare laws. In other words, just to be clear about the importance of state oversight that the Trump administration is trying to eliminate with this change in rules, if the new rules were in place, we would never know, right? The state, my office, our partners would never be able to share these stories because the state would have no oversight role with these children. That's one piece of what the Trump administration is trying to take away, that state oversight of these children who are here in our state. So I think I mentioned before, these stories are part of a declaration that we'll be filing as a part of this litigation. So later on today, the complaint will be filed in California, and then later on this week, the plan is for the states to seek a preliminary injunction to put a stop to this policy while the court takes the time to make a final decision on the merits. As you know, we've sought injunctive relief frequently, going back to the first Muslim travel ban, seeking injunctions stopping the changes in the DACA program for Dreamers. So that is where we go to court. It's a high standard to meet. We've been very successful with this, where we ask the court, hey, before you have a chance to rule on the merits, we're asking you to put a stop to the policy pending that final decision. We'll be filing that motion later on this week, and the declaration that we're linking to in our press release, and that's available to you, will be a part of that motion seeking injunctive relief. Prolonged detention of children and families in prison-like conditions will have profound long-term impacts on their mental and physical health. This is the consensus of child psychologists everywhere. It's also common sense. So why is Washington involved in a case about conditions at the border? That is a question I ask my team every time before we file. What's the harm here in Washington State? Why would we be involved in any litigation against the federal government? In the last fiscal year, ending in July, 566 immigrant children were released to sponsor families in Washington State. Since 2013, more than 2,500 children have been released into Washington. When we welcome those children into our communities, state-run programs and services bear the burden of the long-term impacts of the trauma those children endured in detention. In today's lawsuit, we assert that the new rules violate the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause and the Administrative Procedures Act. You've heard me speak about the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, quite frequently at these press conferences, and we've been very successful with our litigation when courts have agreed that the administration refuses to follow proper procedures in changing federal policies. So again, we are asking the court to block the implementation of these rules and declare them invalid. This administration's blatant disregard for the basic human rights of immigrant children is truly breathtaking. None of us here will allow the Trump administration to go forward with this change in policy. And just as a final note, I'll just say that before we open up to your questions is, there have been times in our country's history we've engaged in very shameful practices, right? So just yesterday I was on Bainbridge Island, and there's a memorial, right, for what happened with the internment of Japanese Americans in this country. It's a shameful chapter in this nation's history, right? I've taken my kids to a Japanese American internment camp. It's outrageous what happened. We're embarrassed as a country that we did that. The breakup of Native American families is a shameful chapter in our nation's history that we all deeply, deeply regret. And the harms from those practices live on today. I have no doubt in my mind at all that someday my kids, all of our kids, will look back and say, what on God's green earth were all of you thinking? What were you possibly thinking as a nation to treat children this way? There is no doubt in my mind. We are here today because we want to say that Washington State is not going to be a part of that. We're not a part of that. We want no part of it. What we want to do is put a stop to it. It's outrageous. It needs to stop. Thank goodness in our country we have the rule of law. We can file litigation with other AGs in federal court in California and seek to put a stop to it. So far, we have not lost a case yet against the Trump administration. As you know, we've won 21 consecutive cases. There are many reasons why we win, including the great work of my team and our partners, but a part of it is this administration's singular inability to follow the rule of law time after time after time. And this case, I'm confident, will be no different. So with that, we look forward to taking your questions, and other folks who are here today will no doubt help out in answering questions as well. And what we'll do is we'll try to repeat the questions, because I know there are folks on the line, so we'll try and repeat the questions as well. Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah, hi. So can you describe a little more about these children? So you interviewed 28 children in July, is that right? And then which facilities exactly were they in? And can you explain the process for how they got there? So were they held for 20 days according to the Flores Agreement in border facilities, and then released to facilities here, or released to families here? Could you explain that more?
So I'll repeat. I'm sure that my team and Julie may have a thought as well. So just to repeat, sort of a multi-part question, but I think the thrust of the question was, can we tell you more about these children who are part of our declaration? How long were they detained? That type of thing. Is that the thrust of it? So I'm going to.
And where are they here exactly?
And where are they here?
Yeah.
So who wants to? Yeah. So Julie from Kind. will go first. You mind just repeating your
Sure.
Julie? Go for it.
Sure. And again, I'm Julie Biltar. I'm the Senior Director for Legal Training and Technical Assistance with Kids in Need of Defense. We're a national organization with 10 offices across the country. In the state of Washington, we provide pro bono representation to unaccompanied children in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So the children that they interviewed were in the custody of Refugee Resettlement after having been transferred from a CBP facility. I don't want to get into the specifics of each case, but what we do for those children who are in ORR custody is provide them with legal orientations and intake, and then provide them with pro bono representation as they go forward fighting their case before immigration authorities. Each child will have a different situation, and we can follow up later on how you might contact ORR in those facilities if you would like more information on that.
Were they in facilities or were they released to sponsors, to relatives or other sponsors?
I believe that they were in the facility, in the ORR facilities when the Attorney General's office spoke to those children.
And they have been held in facilities at the border?
Again, I don't know the specifics of the case. I would think that they had been held at a facility at the border for some time before being transferred to an OR facility, as that's generally what happens.
That is correct. Your assumption is correct.
Okay.
And do we know which facilities?
The question is, do we know which facilities? Are you talking in terms of here in the state of Washington or at the border?
No, here in Washington.
Go right ahead.
We can tell you that ORR contracts with various facilities across the state for about 100 beds for children who are being transferred from the border and awaiting either release to sponsors or the pendency of their immigration proceeding. The exact facilities in which these children were at the time they were interviewed by the Department of Youth and Family Services, I think is something that the kind attorneys would address separately as a privacy concern.
Yeah.
And this is Laura Clinton, by the way, who I introduced earlier from my office.
So just to clarify, I'm sorry, because this is complicated, but so currently the children are being held with their families, their parents at the border, isn't that right? No?
Some children may be held with their parents, some children may be held on their own if they're designated unaccompanied, but by the time they're transferred to the state of Washington into the OR facilities, they have been determined to be an unaccompanied alien child, or a UAC, and that's why they're held in OR facilities.
Laura, is there anything you want to add to that? So, You're good,
I
yeah.
think that was,
Yeah.
did the answer address your question? I think it was pretty clear.
Yes, but the Flores rule, that affects children who are being held with their parents, is that right?
No. The Flores Agreement governs the standards for holding unaccompanied children. So part of the new rules is to allow the administration to hold families together in facilities that are not regulated by the states. So the original Flores Agreement set the floor, if you will, the standards, bare minimum standards for detention of children in ORR contracted facilities. That's the 100 beds that we have here in Washington. The enlargement by regulation of the ability to detain children indefinitely with their families is one of the problematic aspects of the regulation that the lawsuit challenges.
Yes.
Bob, can you be more specific about the language of the injunction you intend to file? What specific policies or actions will you be seeking to stop?
Sure. So my team may want to add to it, but anytime we go seeking injunction, what we're asking in this case is that what the Trump administration announced last week in essentially rolling back their key requirements under the Flores Agreement that governs basic standards with these children, that they not be allowed to go forward with those changes. So we're going to go to the court and say, hey, you can't do that. You can't eliminate state oversight of these children, right? You cannot have indefinite detention of children at the border. You cannot do those things. So again, just to be 100% clear, if we're successful with that, that puts a stop to the policy, but the case would continue until the judge ultimately makes a decision after lots of motions are filed and arguments heard. The judge ultimately would still need to make a decision. In order to be successful with that, we have to show the court that we're likely to prevail when the judge eventually reaches that decision. Yeah, you bet. Thank you. Yes.
Sorry, can I go back to just to clarify?
Yes.
I thought the Flores settlement covered both accompanied children and children with their parents, that it was later expanded to cover both children and their parents.
So Laura, do you want to speak to that? So this is Laura Clinton from my office. Go right ahead.
No, the Flores
Go right to the
Agreement.
microphone. Yeah, go right
Do you
on
want to
down. No,
address
go-
it, Julie?
go for it. No, go.
I mean, the Flores Agreement addresses the conditions under which the federal government can detain children traveling alone.
And then in a later settlement agreement, this is Julie Bildhauer, it was expanded for all children in federal government custody. So there was the expansion subsequent to the initial filing.
Okay, that's what I, okay, great.
Is it your, this would be anybody, your opinion or observation that the federal government is currently observing the Flores standards or not?
Do you want
And
to?
so,
Yes.
so my
I don't
next,
think you-
my next question after
Yeah,
that
so-
would be, is if they're not following
Yeah.
what the current standards are, how
Yeah.
is litigation
Sure.
to hold their feet to the
Yeah.
fire going to change that?
Yeah, so it'll come as no surprise to you when I say that no, the Trump administration is not meeting the standards under Flores, to put it very mildly. That said, when you've seen litigation and arguments in courts, for example, about toothbrushes or basic conditions for children, that's been because individuals, organizations can go into court and say, hey, you have this agreement that they're required to meet, and they're not doing it. So to the extent there is transparency about what's going on, to the extent that someone is trying to hold the federal government's feet to the fire, is because that agreement is in place. The administration, rather than meeting that legal obligation, and I would argue moral obligation, instead of doing that, they now are simply saying, you know, we don't even want to have those obligations at all. Please get rid of them.
They're tapping.
That would be a polite way of describing it. Yes, they want to say we don't want to have to deal with it, and that includes the state oversight. To the extent that the stories I was able to convey to you because of the work of my team in the state, that's only because the state right now has that oversight. We have the ability to go in and communicate with those children, right? And if the Trump administration has its way, that would be completely gone. So, is what's happening at the border, even with the Flores Agreement, disastrous? Yes. Would it be far, far worse without it? You better believe it. And so, yes, we want to maintain that Flores Agreement for the reasons that I mentioned, and that's important going forward. But I think it's important. I just want to emphasize that what the Trump administration is doing is saying, we don't even want to have to abide by those minimal standards at all.
One other question, this is from Essex Porter on community.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Anything locally, there's a new report this morning about immigrants with special medical status being ordered to leave the U.S. Anybody seeing anything on that locally? I just read
Anybody?
No.
There are some
That's a
cases
good
of
question.
East, California.
So we can pass on Essex. I don't think anyone here is aware or able to speak to that now, but we're happy to. We'll make a note of that, and we'll do some checking around. But
Anybody that sent me a link, anyone interested in it, I'm here if you want to look at it.
it's a deal. Yeah, we'll look for some more information. Yes.
So can you talk more about the state oversight piece?
Mhm.
So now you have state oversight of the ORR facilities in Washington State, right? So the new rule would say that you wouldn't have any authority or oversight over the ORR facilities in Washington State?
So the question, I should have been doing a better job repeating questions for folks on the phone. So the question goes to the state's oversight of these facilities. So what does it mean exactly, and what precisely would we lose under this
Yeah,
change?
and how does that relate to these facilities that the Trump administration wants to hold families indefinitely? Obviously,
Yes.
Washington State doesn't have oversight over those border facilities. So the Trump administration says that the states on the border would not have oversight of those facilities, and Washington would lose oversight over ORR facilities as well.
So the question goes to state oversight of these facilities, whether here in Washington or elsewhere. And Laura, do you want to take the first? So Laura Clinton from my office take the first crack at that. Laura.
If I could start by untangling just a little bit. The state regulates facilities in Washington where children are cared for out of the literal physical care and custody of their children, or of their parents, pardon me. So the ORR facilities that we're talking about are actually just state facilities, licensed group care homes, secure facilities that care for children. They contract, these state facilities, state-owned, state-licensed facilities, contract with ORR for that roughly 100 beds in the state of Washington. The state, through the Department of Youth and Family Services, has licensing authority over the physical facilities. So the facilities must meet our building codes, our fire codes. The care providers must have adequate training and be able to provide educational services that meet our standards, healthy food provision and basic sanitary conditions for the care of these children out of the care of their parents. What the new rules would allow is for the creation of family facilities that would not be subject to those same licensing standards, in which the federal government could detain indefinitely kids in the company of their parents in facilities to which we would not have the same regulatory oversight and access.
Throughout the country? Like, would you expect some of those
Yes.
facilities in Washington?
We are not currently aware of any family detention facilities in Washington, but yes, that is a realistic possibility under the agreement.
And would we lose oversight over the current facilities that contract with ORR?
Not to the extent that they continue to carry a state license. So the existing licensed facilities would not somehow be immune from state regulation, but new or additional facilities that cater to families that would be detained by the government would not be subject to the same licensing requirements. Do you have other things you'd like to add to? Okay.
Could I just ask a little bit more detail? You say facilities, I heard group homes, individual homes, I mean, institutional facilities. I'm just trying to get my mind around where the kid, what kind of environment the kids in.
So we're largely talking about facilities that care for children that are not individual sponsor families. We're talking more institutional settings, group homes, secure facilities for children who have particular safety issues or concerns that merit a higher level of security. But for the most part, we're talking about group homes. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have
Oh,
that?
sorry.
Perfect. Okay.
Go ahead.
Are there any migrant children being held in Washington now?
Yes.
We know how many?
It's up to 100 beds. As Attorney General Ferguson was explaining, that number is in flux because every day kids are brought into our jurisdiction by the administration, and every day they're released. So that number does fluctuate. We have about 100 beds in contracted facilities throughout the state.
Any idea if the kids in these facilities have been caught up in local immigration enforcement efforts, local, meaning Washington State, or are they being transferred from the southern border?
We do know that the majority of the children that were spoken with recently were transferred here from the southern border and were subject to those conditions of confinement that you've read about in the press. As to
It varies, but generally over the last few years, the children who have been in OR custody in Washington State have been apprehended at the border and transferred up to the facilities in Washington State. So, and I believe that that has been the trend even going through this summer.
If I could just add to that point, it is not, it's not necessary that a child who was transferred here have any real connection to Washington. ORR has contracts for beds across the country and sends the children in its care to those facilities as they become available.
Any coordination of this effort with other states?
The lawsuit, you mean? Yes, yes. Would you like to speak?
Sure. And so, sorry if I wasn't clear on that earlier, but
You may have been.
you know that's okay. There's a lot of information I understand. So my team will correct me if I'm wrong, but the litigation that'll be filed today will be filed by 20 different attorneys general. Is that correct? So it's 19 states, including Washington and the District of Columbia. So 20 states. Just to be clear, sometimes that can change even the last minute, but as we understand it right now, that'll be 20 different AGs that'll be filing. And that, of course, is relatively common for the litigation that we bring. We often work together closely with our colleagues across the country. And those states would have similar impacts. Yes.
Double check. Is this the 47th lawsuit or the 48th lawsuit that you're filing this year?
I believe this is the 47th lawsuit that we filed against the Trump administration so far. That's correct.
That's 20 AGs, including District of Columbia?
That's exact, 19 states plus the District of Columbia. But I just want to emphasize that can sometimes change even the last minute, but that is our understanding of what will be happening later on today. But you will want to double check when that is actually filed later on today. But that's our understanding currently.
Is there a
That's
leader
correct.
of the
It's being filed in California, so California. Yes, absolutely. So typically the state where not typically, I think always, where the litigation is being filed, that state is invariably the lead state. Sometimes you have a co-lead. The Dreamers case, for example, we are co-leading with New York, filed in New York, but we co-led with them. But always the state where it's being filed is a lead, if not the lead in the litigation. That's correct.
Do you happen to know if any of the other teams or states other than California are joining this lawsuit?
Could you repeat that one more time? I didn't quite catch it.
Mexico, Arizona, Texas.
Oh, I'm going to turn to my team for border states that are joining. Is that the question? You guys happen to know off from memory?
Was the question specific to border states?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So California.
California, New Mexico?
California, New Mexico, and Washington, of course. is a border
California,
state.
New Mexico are the two border states we're aware of, yes.
Southern border.
Southern border, yes, sorry, southern border, yes, thank you. Any final questions that folks have? And then Julie, if you have a final thought before we wrap up. Oh, yes, go right ahead. But no, I don't, thanks for the questions. This is complicated. I might spend a fair amount of time with the team sorting this all out. So, no, by all means, if anything we can do to clarify, yeah.
Unaccompanied kids have long been coming to
Mhm.
Washington State. That's not new, and I know Kind has been representing us for quite some time. So these kids that you have now interviewed, are they coming from any different facilities at the border, or have the facilities that they're coming from at the border gotten worse, leading to these conditions that you describe in your lawsuit?
Do you want to?
Would you like to speak to that, Julie? or-
You know, I think, to repeat the question, are the facilities that the children have been coming from the same facilities that they've been coming from in the past, and have they gotten any worse? I think media reports over the summer have shown some changes to some of the border facilities. And that's where it's my understanding these children were held in before being transferred to the programs in Washington State that ORR contracts with. As for changes that have come about, I think we are all seeking adherence to the Flores standards, the Flores Settlement Agreement. We would like that to continue. And so as we go forward, we look to continue our legal representation of the children before immigration proceedings once they're transferred here. But as for changes in the facilities at the border, we have heard that there have been changes, that they have gotten more difficult. Conditions, as you can tell, have gotten more difficult. And so most of those kids have been transferred directly up from the border.
Colleen had something.
And Colleen would
I
like
was
to
just
add
going to
something.
add, so
If you introduce yourself, Colleen.
I'm Colleen Melody. I manage the civil rights work for the AG's office. So the children range in age who we spoke to from 12 to 17. Some know the name of the facility where they were detained, but many don't. They were picked up, told nothing, given no answers to their questions. And so they can describe the facility where they were detained, but they don't know its name. And in the declaration that's prepared by Alma Paletti, the investigator in the Civil Rights Division, they talk about what those conditions are. They talk about how long they were detained, right? But almost all of them were detained at the border in these facilities for some number of days and then transferred directly to Washington. Yeah.
Can anyone speak to the source of the information you're seeing in these reports here? Do you know where that comes from?
We do. The source of the information for the posters is Ms. Paletti's declaration.
So the declaration that we have available today and linking on our website, those points related to the conditions experienced by those children are what they told our team in those interviews, and those experiences have been put together in a declaration that Alma from our office has put together for the court.
So just to be clear,
Yes.
that information comes from investigators associated with your office.
Licensing.
So in other words, the state has this oversight role, right? So we were part of groups of individuals from the state in that oversight capacity, sitting down with those children. These were the stories they told. That's been put into in July. Thank you. Over a few days in July. During that 3-day period, there were 28 of these children in those, so 100 beds that are available. At that moment in time, this fluctuates, just to emphasize, right? That moment in time when we did these interviews, there were 28, my team will correct me if I'm wrong, 28 children. These are essentially their stories. And by the way, I would.
Make sure I do the sort.
Do you want to add, and Julie's going to add something to that. Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
And I would just like to add that these interviews with the state licensors are different than the interviews that we do in the course of the child's immigration case. So these interviews were done, as the Attorney General said, in connection with the licensing of the facilities, not in connection with the child's immigration cases.
Introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Representative Lillian Ortiz Self, and I think I speak for all the legislators up here when I say I want to thank the Attorney General's office for continuing to support and advocate for our most vulnerable residents in the state of Washington. I've got to tell you that as someone who's a school counselor and a mental health counselor and is out in the trenches seeing the impact of the policies of this administration on our immigrant families and our children, it is horrifying to see what is happening out there, and the ripple effects are great. But I've got to say that we stand together with the Attorney General's office in making it clear that any resident in the state of Washington, any child that is within our borders, we will fight for. We will continue to lift our voices in unity to say that the advocacy, the supervision, that must take place to advocate and give a voice to those who are voiceless will continue to happen within our borders. What this administration is trying to do is more of the same, lack of transparency, silencing the voices of our states and those that want to protect our most vulnerable. And we can't let that happen. As a mother, as a politician, as a counselor, as an advocate, I cannot let that happen. And so we will continue to fight to make sure that through us, through everyone's in the state of Washington, that the kids have a voice. They're not silent. They come with families that have been torn apart, and we owe it to them. And so even if our federal administration turns a blind eye and treats them inhumanely, it stops here when they enter our borders, and we stand strongly for that. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Senator Lisa Wellman. I chair the Early Learning K-12 Education Committee in the Senate. Totally in support of our Attorney General and the state of Washington, and so proud that we stand up for children. But I do want to make the point, I just completed a tour of all of our 9 education service districts around the state, speaking to superintendents, speaking to people in the education service district who offer services throughout our 295 school districts, and speaking to a lot of early learning providers. And I do want to point out, it's an important thing. This isn't just about immigrant children. The trauma that is being inflicted on our country is to all of our young children. They don't differentiate immigrant children from what can happen to them. And speaking to teachers across this state and hearing the stories of children who are scared that they may be coming for so-and-so's mommy, but they could be coming for my mommy or daddy, and these things can happen to us, is inflicting trauma on our children, and we're hearing about it. We have to stop.
So just a final thought, then we'll all be available for questions you may have afterwards. Just a couple final points. First, thanks to everybody who's joined us today. All these cases, they're all a heavy lift. It takes a lot of partnerships, a lot of folks who you see and some of you don't see, who put a lot of time into making these cases happen, and this case is certainly no exception to that. Number 2, the declaration that we've referred to, I would encourage all Washingtonians to read it. It is not easy to read, I can assure you, but you know, I often say that all this federal litigation, really all litigation in general, there's a story behind any lawsuit you file, right? Even if it seems arcane in the law, there's always a story. Some stories are more compelling than others. Some are difficult to hear. You know, the story that's in this case is told in that declaration. And again, I encourage all Washingtonians to read it. Lastly, you know, having given a lot of thought to a lot of litigation against this administration over the last 2.5 years, you know, I think that there are basic fundamental values of who we are as a people that are at stake in all these lawsuits. Look, I get that as a country there's disagreement about immigration and how we should handle immigration issues, right? I think there can be an honest policy debate about that. That said, I am confident that the values we hold as a people are being violated every single day with the way in which our government treats these children who come across the border. And, you know, that's a value we have as parents, as counselors, as teachers, as, you know, as just people, right? Is to, for God's sakes, treat kids with a little bit of humanity. I don't think that's too much to ask. It shouldn't be too much to ask. But apparently it is with this administration. And so I think the way we view our role here is to to do everything humanly possible that we can under the law to put a stop to it, to communicate to the people of our state that we do not support what the Trump administration is doing, and it is our objective to put a stop to it as soon as possible. We really appreciate all of you being here today and look forward to taking more questions informally afterwards. Thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate it.